There we go. Hi there. Welcome, everybody. We've got John Connolly here joining us virtually at the Mysterious Bookshop. We'll give people a couple of minutes to join us, but we can at least catch up on. We are here talking about the newest Charlie Parker, 19th in the series, The Nameless Ones. Today is the publication date. We have been furiously sending out copies of this book along with
God bless you, Ryan. God bless you. You're doing God's work.
we've got book plates, we've got signed oversized cards, we've got tote bags. So if you haven't ordered your copy from the Mysterious Bookshop yet, you should do that very, very soon. How does it feel today? How does publication day feel to you, John? Is it still exciting?
God, I remember the very first. I remember when Every Dead Thing came out, which in Ireland was 1998. It came out just before Christmas, and I had not received a finished copy of the book. It really was rushed to get to Ireland, and I was walking by what was Dubray Bookstore. It was used to be in a different position on Grafton Street. And I'm walking by and thinking, God, that looks a bit like the cover of my book. And there was a shelf, the top shelf had been packed with this book for Christmas. And a woman walked in, took it off the shelf, read the dust jacket, looked at it, scowled, and put it back on the shelf again and walked out. And after that, I was never the same again. Publication day was always just a source. It's a source of worry and more than anything else, I think. You want the book to do well, as much for my publishers as anything else.
Sure.
I've long, thankfully, there are a couple of things I don't do anymore. I can't remember the last time I read an interview with myself, because that way lies madness. I want to read to see what I have to say about me. And the other thing, although we're all, if I open a newspaper and they happen to have at the bottom of it, John Connolly, The Nameless Ones, you wouldn't be human if you didn't look at it.
Right.
But I don't go searching out reviews, and I don't look at people's comments online. I don't think any of those things are very helpful to me or my very fragile artistic ego by this stage of my life. So mostly you just hope that people like the book, that it does okay with the publishers. I'm as a compulsive reader myself, I recognize that readers only have so much time.
Yeah.
And more annoying. And I was listening to something Mark Billingham said at a festival in London, or a festival in Cheltenham, I think, last week, where he was talking about if you're not enjoying a book after 50 pages, you should throw it away. Now, I don't agree with that. I think there are some books that require a little bit of effort, perhaps, and you have to stick with them. Or else everybody in my house would be dodging books left, right, and center. The dogs wouldn't come anywhere near me. But I'm quite bad at doing that. I'm quite bad at setting down a book that I'm not enjoying, because I always blame myself. I feel that I'm at fault, and I don't want to let the book down, because the book's feelings will be hurt and it will talk about me with the other books on the shelves. And the next thing I know, I'll have no books at all. So I try and stick with them. But the awful thing is, if you're not really enjoying a book, and you're somebody like me, a book that you're not enjoying takes you much longer to read than a book that you are enjoying, because you're reluctant to pick it up, and you don't want to pick up something else, and you're reading and you find you're reading it slowly before you go to bed. And so I don't want to be one of those people, and I don't want to be one of those people producing those kinds of books. So I worry about all of those things.
Sure. Yeah. I think I read an introduction of yours in one of the previous books that typically your new book is a reaction to what you had written beforehand. So if one is particularly violent, the next one may not have that. The book before The Nameless Ones was The Dirty South. So we went all the way back to the beginning of Charlie Parker, so refresh readers' memories, where we are at with The Nameless Ones, sort of reset us up for who we're following and where we're at and where the series is going here.
Well, The Dirty South was very much it's set in one small town. I don't know if you remember, it was a film some years back called Red Rock West, which I always liked, which was Nicolas Cage kept trying to leave this small town. I just couldn't, because every time he tried to, he'd end up back in there again. It always stuck with me. And so Dirty South is set very much in one small county in Arkansas. It never really moves from there at all. And so the natural reaction to that is to write a book where people go anywhere they want to at all, like a range. And I love globe-trotting thrillers. I've always liked them. I like Daniel Silva. I think the geopolitical situation is slightly more complicated than Israel good, everyone else bad. But within that, I really enjoy the books. I think he's a very clever writer. And I wanted to write one of those books. I'm also a big John le Carré fan. I like espionage novels. And so I very much wanted with the Nameless Ones to write one of those books where characters are moving from country to country, from place to place. And oddly enough, then, I was writing that book at a time when nobody could go anywhere. We were all stuck in the same place.
Right.
And there was a brief moment where I thought, God, do I have to make allowances for COVID? And do I have to mention it? No, the book is set pre-COVID, so it would be slightly ridiculous. But in part, I thought there was actually something quite escapist about being able to read a book that jumps from Austria to Paris to the Czech Republic to Serbia, when the police are tapping on your car window if you're going in Dublin. It was more than 5 kilometers from home. Right. And so it turned out to be an apt book, because I think one of the things that we underestimate about the pleasures, particularly of genre fiction, is escapism. There is nothing wrong with literature that takes you out of your life. And I think during the last 18 months or so, a lot of us became very appreciative of fiction or TV shows or films that took us out of this awful situation we were all in and allowed our imaginations to wander, And nobody wanted to read a book about a play. Well, actually, some people clearly did. I wasn't one of them. So I wanted to... There are two characters who began, I guess, as subsidiary characters many, many, many moons ago, and have gradually kept moving themselves front and center in the books, who are called Angel and Louis. And I'd written one book in which they played quite a larger role than usual. And I'd never really been able to find something for them to do that would allow them to move front and center. And then the Nameless Ones did, because it is a book in which an old friend of Louis is killed, and Louis realizes that one of the reasons he's been killed, it relates to something Louis did some time in the past, and it's revenge for that. And so Louis sets out to actually hunt down the people responsible for killing him. And they've holed up in different countries. They're a group of Serbian gangsters who are desperate to get home, because if they can get home, no one can touch them. Which is really the reality. Serbia has some very interesting relationships with its neighbors and with a lot of the European courts. And so they know that if they can get back home, nobody's going to be able to touch them. So there is a ticking clock. He needs to get them before they can get home. And they realize that gradually this net is closing on them. And I suppose there's something amusing, not amusing, but what you have essentially are people cheering for one group of killers against another group of killers. Which, when you think about it, is not an ideal system of morality, and nevertheless, you create a situation where people are basically on the side of Angel and Louis, and Angel and Louis have no qualms about hurting these people, and that's not really necessarily the way that we should live our lives, but in the covers of a book, we'll go along with it.
Absolutely. I had a customer come into the Mysterious Bookshop a couple of weeks back, and he had this elaborate tattoo on his arm that was inspired by and dedicated to Louis and Angel. It was a padlock,
really?
A bullet going through it. It was really well done. And I was surprised. One, I was happy to find another Charlie Parker kindred spirit to talk to about, yes, I love these books, but also, what do you think? Where do you think that intense sort of attachment to Louis and Angel comes from? Like, did you ever imagine that these two characters would kind of come up with a following of their own in this series?
Not at all. When they turned up in the earlier novels, they kind of arrived on the page fully formed, but they were very much what I thought of as secondary characters at the time. My thinking about how characters and the idea of secondary characters has evolved a lot since then.
Yeah.
I mean, they very much were. I think in part, the Parker books, Parker's quite a tormented figure, and also he's a quite a moral figure. He is concerned with notions of justice, with the idea, can you be the finger on the scales? What does this cost you? Mm-hmm. Louis and Angel have none of those qualms. Their system of morality is entirely black and white.
Yeah.
And I think there's something appealing about that when set alongside Parker. But I also think secretly most of us would love to be, when your neighbor won't hand you back the lawnmower to say, giving you one warning, and then I'm going to call the guys who are going to come around, and you can pick up the phone, and if you're in trouble, they will drop everything or they will be by your side. And they, you know, whatever, if you say a wrong has been done to you, they will believe you. They are not going to contest it at all. And there's a kind of joy to that, the idea that we could have somebody like that by our sides. But I think also, you know, they are, I hesitate to use the word crusade, but I think at one point Angel asks, when do they become contaminated by morality? That some of Parker's morality is rubbing off on them.
Yeah.
And they have committed themselves to him. They've committed themselves to his cause. And his cause is very much one of righteousness, I guess, righteous vengeance. And I think they also understand that they alongside him, because this position, this series of actions can't be sustained. At some point, you know, they realize they're getting older. They keep putting themselves in the way of harm, as does Parker. And they realize, as Parker does, that this whole story is moving towards a conclusion. And that conclusion may lead to their end. But that doesn't trouble them. They actually have had a conversation, one of the books, where they go, we don't mind, because this is better than the other option. You know, the other option for us would have been a form of damnation. We're moving towards something. And so I think all of those things resonate with, and they're funny.
They're great.
You'll forgive people a lot if they're funny. You know, you kill everybody. My mum reads the most violent crime novels. She reads stuff that I
really?
Oh my God, the woman. Yeah, people ask me, where did you come from? And I kind of go, where does all this stuff come from? I can point at my mum. And she's like that, you know, you can kill as many people as you want. You can eviscerate them, but don't have sex afterwards and don't swear. Okay, they're the two rules, you know. So I think kind of being funny falls into those. You kill anyone you want, as long as you're amusing about it.
Yeah, no, sage advice. I know when the Dirty South came out, reviews pointed out that it might have been a good jumping in point for new readers. That if they hadn't been, you know, keeping up with the series now, the Dirty South was a good place. You'll get to know Charlie Parker before the one that we all know now. But you also pay a lot of attention to rewarding your the readers who have stuck with you, who have read all of the books, but also realizing that someone could walk into a bookshop, see the Nameless Ones on the shelf, which is number 19, pull it down, and should still be entertained. What kind of thought went into that for this one, the Nameless Ones, after kind of resetting the field a little bit with the Dirty South? It at least felt that way a little bit. I don't know if that felt that way for you.
It gets harder and harder. One of the issues I always had with a certain type of crime writing was that, unlike fantasy or science fiction or historical fiction, books didn't tend to link with each other. Characters didn't appear to have any memory. You know, last week they'd solved this incredibly intricate, gruesome crime. It was like they got erased and they popped out again. And one of the pleasures for me of reading genre fiction is quite often that these characters bring their histories with them and acknowledge them. And so the Parker books try to do that. They try to, you know, if you start with Every Dead Thing and finish with the Nameless Ones, your experience of reading the books is going to be very different than if you had dipped in here and there, because you'll see that gradually pieces of a larger story are being told. They're being told very subtly, I hope. And characters who maybe figure briefly in book 8 suddenly assume center stage in book 18 or 19. And because I trust readers' intelligence. You know, stupid people don't read. It's a really good test of finding out if somebody was kind of dumb. You go into their house, and if they don't have any books, you turn around. They could be saving children in Africa, but if they don't have any books in the house, I'm going to be saying, listen, thanks very much. Thanks for the invitation. I'm going to take my bottle of wine. It's going to have a lovely evening, and I'm going to go home again. So I trust readers' intelligence, but I do. If you want to pick up the Nameless Ones, certainly it sets the scene. It gives you all the information that you're going to need, and then you can dive in and decide whether you want to read another book. And that's always the test. For one of the loveliest comments or emails you can get is for somebody to say, look, I picked up book X and I liked it so much that I went back to the beginning. And then we were saying earlier, one of the difficulties for writers is that we kind of hope we're getting better. We may not be. This may be an illusion we keep in our heads just so that we can sustain a career and not go into our publishers and go in a monastery. And so, when somebody says, "Oh, I went back to Every Dead Thing," there's a little part of you that goes, I hope, forgive me my errors, my failings, because I've learned so much since then, and I'm a better person, and I hope the books have got better." But occasionally people will say, I often think I have a lot of affection for Black Cherry, James Lee Burke. James Lee Burke, I just think is just one of the most extraordinary writers, and was a huge influence on me.
Yeah.
I like Black Cherry Blues. If people ask me where do I start with James Book, I'd say Black Cherry Blues. Now, there will be people who say, hey, maybe you should go back to the beginning, or maybe that's not the best book. But it was the book during which I discovered Robichaud.
Yeah.
That was the first Robichaud book I read. And therefore, I think a lot of our affection with a series is often tied up with the point at which we come in.
100%.
Don Sanford's Winter Prey. I remember reading that in the 90s and thinking, God, this guy is so good. So still when people come to me, where should I start? I go, you should read Winter Prey. That's really, really good.
Yeah.
So it's a difficult one. And I think occasionally I am aware that sometimes it's nice. People approaching a series, whether it's mine or anybody else's, if you go into Mysterious, there are all these shelves with these extraordinary series in them. Trying to enter a series that's been going on for 20 years can be quite intimidating for a reader.
Sure.
And you don't necessarily want to go back to the beginning because you think that's, I'd like to more or less catch up with where people are. I don't want to be, reading something, so I don't want to be getting yesterday's bread. I'd like today's bread. That would be really good. But also there is the sense sometimes with an ongoing series that a new reader is coming into a conversation that's been going on, or it's like arriving late at the party.
Right.
And, trying to figure out what are people talking about? Maybe I should be at a different party. I should go over and talk to a different group of people who are just starting to talk.
Right.
And so I'm conscious maybe every 5 or 6 books of giving people an entry point.
Yeah.
Point where, you don't have to go all the way to the end. Come in here. Come in with The Wolf in Winter. Come in with, as you say, The Dirty South. Come in with The Black Angel. And you can kind of start afresh there.
Yeah.
And you get along.
I was going to ask you if you have one that you would just never say people should start with. Like, I feel like I would been, if I had started with The Black Angel, I don't know. I feel like I would have lost out on some, but I guess everyone's going to have their one. Is there one that you would just never recommend people start with?
No, I'm not sure. There are sometimes I'm surprised. There are books that I'm surprised when a reader says that they really like this particular book because some of them are darker and more difficult than others. I think The White Road is a dark, difficult book and follows on directly from Killing Kind, which was a very different kind of book. It was my Bond villain book.
Yeah.
But I'm always pleasantly surprised when somebody says that. I always think, wow, you've gone in hard.
Right.
And after this, everything is going to be plain sailing for you. So not really. No, the other thing for me is that readers, certainly my readers, know my books better than I do. Because apart from having to briefly look at Every Dead Thing to write Dirty South, because Dirty South, the events of Dirty South take place very much before that book, and I wanted a degree of internal consistency. I'd never looked at any of the Parker books since they came out in paperback. When they come out in paperback, I reread the proofs, so because sometimes they get reset, and you want to make sure. And it's a chance to catch inevitably errors creep through. We can have a conversation about that because that's really on my mind at the moment.
Right.
So it's a chance to correct. But the idea that I would pick up. I'm looking at the shelf. I have them on the shelf beside me because I find something. Almost like I'm afraid the book is going to explode in my face. Because. I can think of nothing worse than having to read something I'd written 15 years ago, because all I will see for me are the things that I might have changed because I'm a different writer now. I was 25, I think, when I started Every Dead Thing, and I'm now 50. Yeah. I know how you're not 50. It's when you say you're not
at all, not even close.
Oh, you stop. So you're a very different writer.
Sure.
And so I think the only book I've gone through again in the interim was the Book of Lost Things. When that was being reissued, I went through it and gave it a very gentle clean. But that's at least is a book that kind of stands by itself.
Sure.
It would be very difficult. I think if I started doing that with the Parker books, the whole edifice would fall apart. And someone should start pulling a loose thread.
Yeah.
That everything is going to disintegrate. So you have to, that thing of learning to live with your mistakes.
Yeah, I agree with you on James Lee Burke. I think I discovered James Lee Burke through a recommendation of yours. In one of your introductions, you bring up this scale of Jeffrey Deaver to James Lee Burke, where Jeffrey Deaver plans everything so meticulously, and tests all the twists and turns, whereas James Lee Burke will sit at his computer, type chapter 1, and just see where the story takes him. You said you were, at that time, were closer to the James Lee Burke end of things. Do you find yourself still there? Do you find now, being 19 books in, you don't think you have to test anything a bit more, or you're still in that kind of place?
Increasingly so.
Wow.
It would be, if I were to plan out, so I'm not sure, it's why I've never taken up chess. My children keep trying to suggest that I play chess, and I can think of nothing more horrible. I hate playing games with them anyway, because I'm quite competitive, and so I go into a sulk when I inevitably lose. I think I haven't played Othello since my son beat me, and we had a dreadful attempt to form family games of Risk. Where I think some people didn't talk to each other for about 3 weeks afterwards. So I don't do those things. I think I always begin with just really the germ of an idea. Mm-hmm. And part of the pleasure for me, and part of the difficulty as well, is having it evolve day by day on the page. Mm-hmm. And I think if I knew something from start to finish, I probably wouldn't want to write it. Funny, short stories are different. When I write short stories, they tend to arrive fully formed. Okay. I tend to know them as because they're very different. Short stories, by and large, are a glimpse, and so they work in a different way. But the idea of spending a year or 2 years writing something that I already knew every twist, and I think I'm probably being a little bit of not every twist and turn. Even Jeff would say that he does a very detailed outline, right, but he's open to change within that. But I suspect he's quite restricted in his change because those books are quite intricate in the mechanisms that they use. Right. Whereas Burke is very much, for me, action is what characters do, and I kind of need to know the characters before I can have them do anything. Yeah, and so I need to get in on the page, and then Parker's approach is the same. I begin presenting Parker with a problem, and then meticulously he begins doing these quite logical steps, and well, how will I approach this, and it's a process of discovery. The whole thing is a process of discovery for me as much as for Parker and for the reader. So I like writing that way. I did know, very occasionally I might know the ending of it, just that how a book may end, the very final scene of a book. But that's not helpful if you still have to get there. That's like knowing where China is, but not having a map. Really. Yeah, I can think it's over there somewhere, but getting there could. But I haven't. That hasn't changed in any way.
Gotcha. Do you have any kind of overarching plan or thought in mind for the series as a whole, even if you don't do it individually by book? Do you kind of see where Charlie and Louis and Angel are headed, or do you kind of allow yourself to be inspired newly with each book for that as well?
I've often kind of said to my other half, Jenny, that maybe I should write the last chapter and stick it in an envelope somewhere along with my will, so that, if something dreadful happens to me on the way home, at least people go, oh, God, so at least you're going to get the exactly, at least you're going to get the ending. That I do know.
Okay.
But how we get there, that's a different matter. And I enjoy writing these books. Because Parker has got older as I've got older, and they become a way of looking at the world for me. I think I've said many times that I would find it, and it's funny, I was chatting to your boss, to Otto, who has been from the beginning a supporter of mine, a very staunch supporter, and a great friend. But I think Otto and I differ about experimentation, about moving away from the series, and in fact moving out of the genre entirely, which I tend to do every second book or so. And that's really important to me to do that, because I find that I think had I just written over whatever it is, 22 years, 19 Parker books on one Parker novella, I probably wouldn't be as enthusiastic about the character. I probably would feel that it'd become a little bit like a hamster on a wheel.
Right.
And I also don't think I would have been able to develop as a writer. And so going off and doing other things enables me to draw a breath, to test out a new muscle, to develop a new skill, and then to apply that to the Parker books.
Right.
Why I hope that maybe as they've gone on, they have, if not got better, they've certainly changed. I think if you were to set Nameless Ones or Dirty South beside Every Dead Thing, stylistically they would be completely different books.
Yeah.
They don't really read the same way anymore, and that's a process of, for me, is development. For some readers who perhaps really like the style of Every Dead Thing, they might think, well, why not go back and be that guy?
Right.
But I'm not sure. Yeah, we liked that guy. The new guy, we don't like so much. He's okay, but he's not the old guy.
Right.
So you have to live it. It's an ongoing, this whole thing is an ongoing examination of what kind of writer I want to be.
Gotcha. You've also brought up not tying too much of what's happening in your books to sort of real events. You've got like Dave the Guesser in The Unquiet, who's based on a real person. And I think the inspiration of something from Dark Hollow might have been in real life. Of course, with the Nameless Ones, you've got the aftermath of the Balkan conflict of '91. Was that a conscious choice? Was that something you wanted to write about, that you were interested in, or was that kind of just organic to where the story was going?
No, I think I've often used that analogy that writers are like magpies. We are forever collecting shiny things. You get attracted by something. And I like research. I become a compulsive researcher, and I read a lot. My crime reading over the last few years is much more contained than it would have been when I was younger. There are writers I enjoy reading, but I become very conscious of gaps in my knowledge, and about every second book I read tends to be nonfiction. I tend to alternate a novel and then a piece of nonfiction. To some degree, when I was writing, I have to look at my shelf now. Song of Shadows. There, I remember that book. That touched a little bit on the Balkan conflict because, what happened in the 1990s in the Balkan. For those people who don't know, there was Tito died at the end of the 80s. As a result, Yugoslavia and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the disintegration of the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia kind of came apart. And it had always been a bit of a Frankenstein's creation of a bunch of states that had previously been independent that were yoked together and held together by Tito's will. But a lot of grievances and animosities remained. And they dated from the 19th century and then into the First World War, and then particularly in the Second World War, where the Croatians essentially sided with the Nazis.
Yep.
And the Serbians became, there was forcible conversions. There were appalling concentration camps. And that, there are people still alive who remember that. And so while Tito was holding all of these people together, there were a lot of people nursing grievances thinking, well, as soon as I get the chance to settle some of these old scores, I will.
Right.
And now, we're having discussions in Europe about, Serbia maybe becoming part of the European Union. And there are issues there, I think, for some Europeans. And Putin is meddling. One of the things when I was doing the research in Belgrade, it was really striking to see you could go in and buy Serbian soccer shirts with Vladimir Putin's name on them. They were very popular in the park. So none of these issues have gone away. And so that becomes quite fertile ground for a writer. At the same time, you have to recognize that you're dealing with a conflict in which people died horribly, in which women in particular suffered terribly. And it is that odd business that we have to recognize when we write crime novels, and that we are essentially writing entertainments in which people suffer.
Mm-hmm.
And readers are getting a kick out of that. Readers are, if I'm writing an exciting scene, I remember interviewing George Pelecanos, and Pelecanos mentioned that. He said, when I write a scene of violence or a chase or whatever it might be, I write those faster. My pulse rate goes up, because there is an excitement to it. And if you're on a plane, those are the parts that make you turn the pages. Mm-hmm. And yet it is an odd thing perhaps to want to read books in which part of the pleasure of them is perhaps this flirtation with violence. And so to go back to your question, when you're dealing with real issues, not real issues, but historical issues, because the books do tend to often touch on real issues.
Absolutely, yeah.
You have to be quite careful, and I certainly didn't want to rub people's noses into the history of the Balkans and say, look here. Well, and the one thing I really didn't want, and one of the things I've learned, don't give people big wadges of italics and say, oh, back in 1999, I remember. Guaranteed to make people kind of think, oh Lord, we're going to learn that bit again. I can probably safely flick through the italics.
Right.
But that's something I've learned. I often say that I don't really give workshops and things, but occasionally if a young writer asks me something, I'll say, get rid of the italics. Nobody wants italics.
It is done.
On my tombstone, my name will be in italics just to spite me. Oh, that would really annoy him. Wherever he is.
I of course subscribe to your newsletter. If you don't out there and you're watching this, you should. It's delightful, I will say. You mentioned that the next Charlie Parker has already been delivered to the publisher. I certainly don't want you to give away anything, and also we're here talking about the Nameless Ones. But what can you at least tell us about either where Charlie's headed or what you were thinking while writing it, or going through what
structurally different. It's quite a long book, but it is in fact it's two short novels that are kind of linked, and they're linked by place and theme.
Okay.
The themes feed into each other. And one of them is during lockdown, I was aware that people were stuck at home and that some people would be queuing for the supermarket, and it was just a miserable time. And the publication of The Dirty South was postponed. We had to postpone it by a couple of weeks. And so I began writing a book that would come out chapter by chapter, day by day, and could be read on a mobile phone. So the chapters will be quite short, 600, 700 words. And also it was a way of almost opening the hood of the car and letting people see the engine, because usually what people see is the 12th, the 13th draft of something I'm doing. But to expose, to allow people to see something that was being written on the hoof before all of that had been done with it, I thought might be interesting.
Yeah.
And so that was called The Sister Strange, and ended up being a very intricate and quite expensive exercise, because you think, I'll just put it up for free. But then we ended up paying translators in 5 countries. So every day it would be translated to 5 languages. And my poor son, who had set up my website and was responsible for this, I think, rued the day that this idea had ever struck me as a good one. But when I came to, and then we removed, once the book had been published, it was removed from the website. It vanished. But when I came to looking at it as possibly publishing it, it didn't work as a novel. You couldn't put it as a novel. It was designed to be read in those little chunks. Right. And so it took a huge amount of revision, and it's now more than twice its original length. So now it's much closer to what people would have seen after all of those revisions. And so it's one of 2 interlinked novels, short novels. They're not novellas because they're 70,000 and 75,000 words each, I think. They're short. Wow. About the length of what something like Ross MacDonald or Chandler would have written back in the day.
Yeah.
But they feed into each other, and I think thematically there are themes that run between them that link them, I think. So it was a chance again to do something slightly different.
Yeah, it also sounds a little bit like Every Dead Thing, where Every Dead Thing was like an hourglass shaped book overall. Like
that's precise. I hadn't thought of that, but you're right, and I shall now steal that. And if you try to say that you come up with it, my lawyers will be on to you like attack dogs.
You're welcome. I also want to also in your newsletter you bring up shadow voices, which I know we have fans of yours that have been calling the shop constantly to make sure that we're getting some of those. I know they're you're already entering a second printing, or about to in the next few weeks. There will be a second printing, but you've said Shadow Voices was the hardest thing you've ever done as a writer. Take us into that a little bit. Why, what is Shadow Voices for those that have no idea about it yet?
Well, I got very annoyed over a period of time in Ireland by people whose writers and critics who seem to have a very regressive attitude towards genre fiction in this country. Mm-hmm. And I also wondered why, when I began writing in the mid-90s, why there were so few models or previous writers that I could look to. There was no continuum. It was like it had ended. In the 19th century, Irish writers dominated genre fiction. We were writing horror, crime, science fiction. An Irish writer named L.T. Mead essentially invents the medical mystery. So Robin Cook and Crichton's estate should be paying royalties to the Mead estate. We were extraordinarily influential, and then something happens in the 20th century, and I was curious to find out what that was. And so I began, over a period of years, delving back into it, delving into this history. And essentially, I wanted to rewrite Irish literary history the way it's presented and say, actually, genre fiction is not central to Irish writing. And it also then, the book became a way of talking about genre fiction in general, because if you have Irish writers like Stoker and Lefanu and Mead, and C.S. Lewis, we forget, was Irish, Nicholas Blake was Irish, it suddenly became a way of talking about genre fiction in general. And so what began as what I thought was something quite simple. I thought, what I'll do is I'll stick together maybe 50 or 60 stories, put my name on it,
Right.
Easy royalties. You won't even have to pay for the copyright. Suddenly became a 450,000 word history with essentially more than a quarter of a
Oh, I think we're frozen a little bit here.
Oh, come right back. Sorry, what was that? Not sure.
Right.
You know what I mean, Joe? That was Colin to Bean pulling the plug on my explanation of Irish literature, thinking I would have that bastard saying things about Irish literature that I don't believe. Because he was very, very dismissive of genre fiction. And so Shadow Voices suddenly became this mammoth exercise. And a lot of it was researched and written during lockdown, where you didn't have access to libraries.
Right.
It became very difficult. So thankfully, it would have been impossible to do a book like this under those circumstances 10 years ago. But an awful lot of older material has been digitized and scanned. And then I had access to academic websites because I'm doing some study at the moment. And then also I would simply write down the things I needed. I would either order them or I would wait for the National Library to reopen, which is what I did. National Library in Dublin reopening, they must have been sick of the sight of me. I would go, I want this dusty box of papers. And so, it's this big chunk of change. My other half very memorably said, it's an awful lot of trouble to go to make a point, she said, as I was almost weeping at the table, going, you don't understand the pain I'm going through. But I think I hope it sets out the stall for genre fiction and an explanation of the importance of it to Irish literature and the importance of genre to literature in general. That's the big aim. Yeah. And I mean, if I fail, then I will never talk to anybody again, and I suspect even my library card will be taken away from me. The don't deserve a library card anymore for writing that. That's a mess.
Right. Was there anything that you came across in this research and putting this all together that threw you for a loop, that surprised you in a way that you didn't see coming?
There were writers that had been buried. Essentially, a lot of Irish writers simply get removed from the canon in the 19th century or in the 20th century. And yet there were some of them that had never been there, really known about to begin with, and maybe only to aficionados. One of the ones that stuck with me is an extraordinary woman called Mary Helena Fortune. And she died, I was writing about it for the Irish Times this week, actually. She died in poverty, nearly blind. She was getting a little pension from, and this is very at the start of the last century, was getting a very small pension from a newspaper called the Australian Journal. But was actually so poor when she died that she was buried in a grave meant for another person. And so her resting place was only discovered in the last 5 or 6 years.
Wow.
And it was only in the 1950s that had been discovered that Mary Helena Fortune was actually, she'd been writing under a pseudonym called Waif Wonder, WW. And she had written hundreds upon hundreds of mystery stories, crime stories. And she's one of the originators of the first person police story. And what was extraordinary about her was that she was a young woman born in Northern Ireland, went to Australia via Canada when she was very young. And she had obviously applied for a job at a newspaper in Australia. as a sub-editor, but had probably signed the letter, M. Fortune. And so when she arrived at the newspaper office, they wouldn't give her the job because she was a woman. They said, no, it doesn't matter how well you write and edit, you're not getting a job in the newspaper. So that was the nature of the trade. And she learns a really valuable lesson then, and she thinks, okay, this isn't going to happen again. So all her stories are submitted under this WW pseudonym. And she's so convincing in these stories, these police procedurals, that all her readers are convinced that this is the work of a policeman, a serving policeman. She's really astute, and she's very interested in what was then in the middle of the 19th century modern policing techniques. And so the newspaper simply doesn't tell anybody she's a woman.
Yeah.
And she dies unknown, And, these are stories. The story that included in Shadow Voices is called Traces of Crime. And it's about the hunt for a sex criminal, a rapist across the Australian. These are not cozy stories. And It's quite clear that at some point she may well have been the victim of sexual assault herself. And I just thought, even if, and when I was writing the introduction to the essay on her in the book, which is quite a long essay, said if the only thing Shadow Voices did was to remind people of this woman's existence, it would have done its job. And even in the Oxford Guide to there's a crime section in the Oxford Guide to Irish Literature. She doesn't even make it into that. She was often assumed to be an Australian writer, because she had spent so much of her life there. So right. She's the one. If nothing else, I'm glad that Irish people will be reminded that this woman existed.
Absolutely. You mentioned that you do try to balance your reading in terms of having something nonfiction and alternating with novels or whatever. Who are some writers right now that you find yourself that fill your cup when you're in between writing your own books?
Well, in crime, I tend to go back to the people that I've always loved. I still love Burke. I still think John Sandford is hugely underrated.
Yeah.
I'm a big admirer of Laura Lippman. I think Laura Lippman's writing is just exquisite, and I think she is a very underrated writer within the genre. And then in nonfiction, I think I have to go away tomorrow for one day. I'm taking the recent biography of Patricia Highsmith.
Oh, great! Yeah,
which I'm curious to read. And alongside it, somebody had said to me, if you like espionage fiction, you should probably read Len Deighton, and I'd never really read Len Deighton, so I'm taking the first of the Game Set a Match trilogy with me as well. Because God forbid, even though I'm going away for one day, and
you won't have anything to read.
Yeah, suppose the plane was delayed and I only had one book, and the Highsmith book isn't long. This is the way we think, and I'm not somebody who reads I don't have a Kindle. I like a physical book. So, I'm taking just a satchel with me, but most of the weight will be the two books, just in case.
Right. And I know you can't be specific about anything. We live in the time of adaptations. There are all these studios that are buying these series and, buying these characters and really want to. I think you mentioned that the Book of Lost Things has being looked at as a limited series type thing with its adaptation right now. Any update in terms of, will people get to see Charlie Parker, Louis and Angel on a screen in some form anytime soon?
People have always been circling it. And I know that some people are very deeply involved in shopping it around again now. I hope so. I have no objection, and I will send you all pictures of my yacht. I think that would be fantastic. I'm a sharer. Don't think that I'm going to be selfish.
Right.
I will send you pictures of me wearing sailor's pants and smoking a Popeye pipe. But I don't know. I think sometimes the books superficially seem easier to adapt than they are. And it's difficult where to start.
Right.
But as you say, but I think that a very interesting actor has expressed interest, very deep interest in playing Parker, and somebody who's very suited to it, and so that may help it along the way. But at the same time, these things move like tectonic plates.
Sure.
So I haven't put down the yacht deposit yet.
Got it. The yacht is still on layaway.
The yacht is even the subscription to yachting magazines are really expensive. They assume that, listen, if you can't afford the magazine, you probably can't afford the yacht either. I do remember there was the most pornographic magazine title I ever saw in my life. Well, I better be very careful. The oddest magazine title I ever saw in my life, scratch the top one, was a magazine called Affluent Golfer. I remember seeing on the front, and was in Los Angeles somewhere. I remember being taken, and on the front of it was Dennis Hopper smoking a cigar. And I remember thinking, the counterculture is dead, man. It's completely dead. So therefore, you know, I somewhere down the line, if you see me on the cover of Affluent Yacht Owner magazine, you know, be forgiving about it. I never pretended to be counterculture anyway.
Sure, right. Would you have any demands, goals, hopes with an adaptation, or would you be sort of comfortable? You've got.
Oh, I don't want anything to do with it. I think I briefly was involved in. I did adapt during lockdown. I did adapt Every Dead Thing, the initial adaptation of Every Dead Thing.
Wow.
Looking at it, and maybe as the possibility of doing it as a film, and it became clear that everything people loved about it would have to be removed to fit into 2 hours and 10 minutes. So that was when they began thinking about something longer. It's a massively time-consuming thing, and also I'm not naturally collaborative. I work by myself, and to work in film or television successfully, you have to be collaborative. You have to be open to that, and I don't think I'm that guy somehow or other. And also, it would seem to me, I enjoy writing novels and working on things like Shadow Voices, and therefore, to sign up for a television series would probably mean that my time that I could give to that would be less, and I think the books would suffer.
Yeah. We're not. Your readers are not interested in that either. So please keep up with.
Okay, like I said, I can probably get the yacht without having to do all that hard work, if that's okay. Yeah.
I want you okay.
I'm hoping. I'm really hoping.
Okay too.
Like, yeah, you want a yacht from me. Everybody wants a yacht from me. You know?
Absolutely. Well, John, I know. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. I
really enjoyed it. It's been a real pleasure. It's been fun.
Fantastic. And I'm so excited to read this, as I know so many other people are. It publishes today, The Nameless Ones, 19th entry in the Charlie Parker series, and Shadow Voices publishes on Thursday. So if you haven't pre-ordered that from anywhere yet, you should do that very soon, but there's more coming their way. So anything else you would like to add or say hello to anyone?
No refunds. No refunds. Okay. I'm sorry, I'd like to help, but no, not going to happen.
It stands here as well, the Mysterious
Bookshop. Fantastic. Well, we're on the same page then, which is very important.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ryan.
Be well, travel safely.
Okay, thanks, folks. Take care. Bye-bye.